We've been going over the 7 railroads that in North America. And now that we are at 7 railroads again.
7 railroads in the Twin Cities.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So this is some highlights of the Great Northern history. There's part 1 is the lines east. That's what they always talked about, east of Havre. Part 2, and there's books that are lines east and lines west. Lines west is west of Havre. And then part 3, we'll talk about the BN merger. So this is just some highlights, because to talk about the Great Northern in a comprehensive fashion, I would be talking for the next 3 months, 24/7, because it's very complex. All the books are very, very thick. So you see, this is the ultimate Great Northern, and this is, of course, the Burlington here. Can you see? How come I don't get a? Do you see the little cross?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the main line. See if I can get that there. No, I can't get a cursor. I don't know why. All right. Anyway, and then of course the main line went out through Wilmer, Fargo, and then up to Minot, to Havre, across through the Rockies, and then through the Cascades to Seattle. That's the main line. And then we'll talk about some of these other lines, because Jim Hill was quite a guy. He really did a lot. And of course, with the Great Northern, you can't talk about the Great Northern without talking about James J. Hill. James Jerome Hill, he was born in September 16th, 1838, and he died May 29th, 1916. And they said it was an infected hemorrhoid. Way too much information. But the moral of the story is, and of course they didn't have all the treatments we have now, take care of your hemorrhoids, because they can get infected. He was Canadian American, and he was chief executive officer of the Great Northern Railway. And because of the impact of the hill lines on the Northwest US and Canada, he became known as the Empire Builder. He was born in Guelph.
Guelph.
How do you say that?
Guelph.
Guelph. Okay.
Yeah, convert the U to a W and you got it. Guelph.
Guelph. Okay. That's Scottish Gaelic, I believe. But so Guelph. Thank you, Craig. He had a childhood accident, and a bow and arrow blinded him in the right eye, but obviously didn't slow him down. When he was 16, he went to Kentucky and worked as a clerk, and apparently he learned bookkeeping from a guy who was really, really good. So at 18, he saw that there was opportunity at the headwaters of the Mississippi, the navigational headwaters, and so he moved to St. Paul. And this is what St. Paul looked like around the turn of the century. Steamboats, there were a little bit of railroads are just coming in, and so he got a job as a bookkeeper at a steamboat company. And in 1860, he went over to work for wholesale groceries, and again he found a guy who was really knowledgeable. And so James J. Hill was handling freight transfers between the railroads and the steamboats. And this way he learned all aspects of freight transportation, and that's one of the reasons he was so successful. Now in 1873, a number of railroads went bankrupt. It was a big panic. They talk about a lot in the books. And the St. Paul and Pacific was a railroad that was started in St. Paul, and then it kind of went up. It was heading for St. Cloud. It's the railroad that ultimately went up through Alexandria and Fergus Falls, and then up to Moorhead. And so he saw an opportunity. So while he was working at the grocers, he researched the St. Paul and Pacific for 3 years. And then he waited until things were just right, and he teamed up with some investors, and they bought the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad. And he used the charter. There was an existing charter, because getting a charter was always difficult because you had to get government approval. But there was a charter for the St. Paul and St. Cloud, or excuse me, Minneapolis and St. Cloud Railroad, that had built, like 2 miles of track, typical thing, sold a bunch of stock.
2 miles.
And so he used that to start the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba Railway. And so the first thing they did, they finished this line up to, I think, Barnesville, and then it went on to Moorhead. And they also built this line west, because this is really a hilly area. It's glacial moraine, lots of curves, you bet. So he built a line straight west to Wilmer, and then up through Benson and Morris. It's flat. And if you've ever ridden rode the Empire Builder before Amtrak, that's how they went. It was quite fast. So they bought our locomotive, which is the William Crooks, and I'm sure you've all seen it. It used to be at the St. Paul Union Depot. Now it's up in Duluth at the Lake Superior Museum. It's kind of amazing if you think about it, 1879, and it's still around. So his goal was he wanted to expand this thing, and he was very good at it. He was very hands-on. He worked long hours. He wasn't one of these guys who go to the golf course and stuff like that. He worked very hard. And his concept was to build to Winnipeg. And because he knew if the Canadian Pacific built east, it was going to be a mess over Lake Superior. It's Laurentian Shield. We'll talk about that. But his idea was build to Winnipeg, and then the CP could build west, and he would haul the freight and they'd have a nice access down into the United States for their freight. And so that was his concept. Now he built a line up to Grand Forks and then on into Canada. It was the Midland Great Northern Railway, which went from the border. He built to the border, and then they built this railroad from the border to Winnipeg. And also they built west of Portage La Prairie. I did not realize that. Later, the Canadian government was putting pressure on it. But in 1969, I was up there, and this is a Midland. It's a lettered Midland. It's orange, like guess who owns it? The Great Northern. And this thing ran between let's see, it's Emerson and Winnipeg. So they had a freight line here, and they would haul freight for the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific. This is also how the Winnipegger got up to Winnipeg, and also the Northern Pacific had this number 14 train that went from Fargo up to Winnipeg. Also, initially the Canadian National had trackage rights on it. That was part of the deal. And then after it was sold to the city of Winnipeg, the Great Northern, Northern Pacific, and the CN all had trackage rights. So the CN was technically the operator, and they did the maintenance. So here's a couple of their GMDs in 1969. And the trackage rights agreements is one of those things, 999 years or whatever. So they went to the Great Northern, and then the Burlington Northern. The BNSF still uses that to get to Winnipeg. But Hill was right. The line, this is north of Lake Superior, and you can see this is a picture from the 50s. It's a FA and FB on the Canadian Pacific, and they're going through one of the many tunnels through granite, and so it was not a fun place to build a railroad. Very expensive, lots of curves, lots of tunnels, and so. Ultimately, because of pressure from the government, they did build east over this mess over Lake Superior, and then they built down to Toronto and across to Montreal, and they built west. And they first, Craig, you might be familiar with this. They built across. They were trying to build across directly across right north of the border, but it was apparently it was not a very good line, and they had to have ferries across some of the lakes and stuff like that. So then later they built across Kicking Horse Pass,
right?
And they'd have spiral tunnels, and which they still have.
Well, they didn't build the spiral tunnels until about 25 years after the line opened.
Oh, okay.
They had real serious grades.
Okay.
And they had to have runaway tracks, and they had 24-hour people stationed at the bottom of the hill with the switch aligned for the runaway track. And they had to come out and watch very carefully, and only at the last minute, when they were sure the train was under control, would they throw the switch and allow it to continue.
Wow.
So the spiral tunnels came by later.
Okay. So anyway, this is
I've seen them.
this red line is the main line of the Canadian Pacific.
Right.
And Hill was right. In 1880, they determined this was a long way to get around and expensive. So they took control of they bought the controlling interest in the Soo line. And so here's the original Soo line that went from Portal, North Dakota to Minot, and then kind of wandered here into Minneapolis. And then they bought the Wisconsin Central, and that went through Fond du Lac, west of Milwaukee into Chicago. And then later, of course, the Soo line bought this is the Milwaukee Road. And so they had the line to, this is the Soo line had this. And then, of course, the CN, which was, I believe, the Canadian Northern, they went up to Yellowhead Pass, which is further, but it's about 2,000 feet lower, and there's a very easy grade. I mean, in fact, if you can imagine, the Canadian National didn't used to have dynamic brakes on their locomotives. It was so the grades are so moderate here, and so it was a much better line. And that's what they were worried about. The Canadians were worried about. There were a lot of Americans moving into British Columbia, and they were afraid if there was a vote that British Columbia would have become an American state. And so they wanted the CP, and in fact, they gave them, the Canadian government gave the money to build a railroad in the southern part of the country.
Yeah, one of the key events in Canadian history happened in Texas, because what happened in Texas was that Texas got taken away from Mexico simply by the weight of the number of American settlers who had settled there. And the Mexicans could no longer hold it. And of course, there was more complicated than that, but that was the basic story. And they were afraid the same thing was going to happen on the Canadian prairies, because people in South Dakota were sick of the conditions there, the lousy water and the 5-mile hauls of water and all that crap. And a lot of them had moved up into the Saskatchewan River Valley and found that the farmland was better. And the Canadians were scared to death of that.
Don't forget that we also invaded Canada 3 times in history.
Yeah, that's true, but we didn't invade that part.
No, but there was thought of it.
Oh, sure.
You do know why the Canadian Mounties have that kind of hat, don't you?
Tell me.
They bought them in Montana.
No kidding.
That's not a lie. They're not supplied we're not originally supplied by Canada.
What years did the U.S. was that the French Indian War, the first one?
I don't know, Ross. I don't.
Well,
but it is 3 times we went in there.
Okay.
During the Revolutionary War.
Not recently. Revolutionary War we did once. I don't know about 1812.
There was a lot of back and forth on that, and each country thought the other one would eventually collapse.
And then must have been War of 1812 too, right?
1812. That was.
I think so.
That was when they burned down Washington and captured Detroit.
Yeah.
So anyway, here's the Canadian Pacific, and here's a little more detail of the Soo line. The Hill was right. I mean, this is now the main line of the CP, Kansas. This is the main line to Kansas City. This thing right here.
Right.
And it goes down. Let's see. I think it's the Gulf Mobile in Ohio to St. Louis, and then down from there. So.
Well, yeah, but the other thing is they can get to Kansas City by avoiding Chicago. They can go right down the Mississippi River.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. With the what the CP had bought here. Yes, the line to Kansas City. Yes, this line here. Yes, you're absolutely right. The Milwaukee had this line, which they built to Kansas City, goes right around the Horn of Iowa there, and then across here to Kansas City. And it was a moderate line for the Milwaukee, because I mean, there's so many railroads running between Chicago and Kansas City, but now it's become extremely important.
Well, now the other interesting thing on here, which has been missed, is that William Cornelius Van Horn was kind of the opposite of James J. Hill. He was the American that moved to Canada and built the CP. But Hill wanted him to build the connection from Winnipeg south of Lake Superior. which was tempting because it's a lot easier to build that than it is through that granite on the north side. But the Canadians could see the trap that if the Americans
That's right.
controlled the main line of their railroad, that they'd be in a position to put the screws to them.
Yeah. But now we have Canadian railroads going all the way to Biloxi, Mississippi.
Yeah.
Well, and pretty soon they'll go all the way to the west coast of Mexico.
Yeah, that's right. So, so anyway, so Hill built west from Grand Forks. He started, and he built it in stages. And the reason that there are all these branch lines up here in North Dakota is because he would build west, and rather than, he watched the NP, which NP came across from Duluth like this, goes through Fargo, goes out through the center of the state, and that went into bankruptcy. I don't even know how many times, because they would just kept building and kept borrowing more money, and it was, you know. But Hill said, no, we're going to build this, and when this was profitable, then he would go west, and he'd build this one and build. And these lines, many of these lines are still in business. The BNSF still uses them because it's very good land up here and reasonably good rainfall. So he kept building west, and so he ended up having the first transcontinental railroad built without public money. There were just a few land grants, and he was one of the few railroads that did not go bankrupt, even during the Depression. The Great Northern did not go bankrupt because he was very careful with the money. It's really set the thing up well. And he was quoted as saying, what we want is the best possible line, the shortest distance, the lowest grades, and the least curvature. And this shows out in Montana. Here comes the, this is in 1970, just after the merger, but the builder, it's west of Havre. The builder's coming around here at about 70. You know, that's a big curve, but by the big long curves, flat grades, they had it was a good railroad.